The advice you've been following your whole financial life was not designed for your income. Here's what I mean. The federal government, not a blogger, not a YouTuber, Harvard researchers using Census Bureau data, found that 70% of renters earning between $30,000 and $45,000 are spending more than 30% of their income on rent alone. 70%. In 2023, that is not a rounding error. That is not people making bad choices. That is almost 3 in 4 people in this exact income bracket being mathematically captured by housing costs before a single other bill hits. And almost every piece of financial advice you've ever heard about saving money assumes you are in the other 30%. Last April, Maya sat at her kitchen table with her phone open to a budgeting spreadsheet. She's 29. She works in logistics administration in Indianapolis. She makes $41,500 a year, which, if you're looking at national median income charts, puts her squarely in the she should be fine zone. Not rich, but fine. She was not fine. She had been tracking every dollar for 3 months. Coffee, cut, subscriptions, canceled. Eating out, down to twice a month. She was doing everything the videos told her to do, and every month she ended up with almost exactly nothing left. Her spreadsheet was not lying to her. It was just showing her something nobody had bothered to name. Her rent, $1,050. Her childcare for her 4-year-old, $975. Her car payment on a used Civic with an 11.9% interest rate because her credit wasn't good enough for better, $310. Insurance, $145. Gas, $120. Utilities, $125. Phone, $60. That's $2,785 a month in costs she cannot meaningfully cut. Her take-home pay is $2,900. She has $115 left for food, clothing, healthcare, and savings every month. She Googled, "Why can't I save money even when I'm trying at 11 p.m.?" You might know exactly what that search feels like. Section 1, the principle. Here's the thing nobody in personal finance is saying out loud, and I think it's because it's genuinely uncomfortable for an industry that profits from selling solutions. There are 2 completely different financial problems. They look identical from the outside, but they require opposite responses. Problem 1 is behavioral. This is the person spending $600 a month on restaurants and $200 on apps they don't open. The 50-30-20 rule was built for this person. Track spending, cut the unnecessary, save the difference. It works. Problem 2 is structural. This is the person where housing, transportation, and essential services already consume 80 to 95% of take-home pay, not because they're careless, but because market prices in their bracket have outrun wage growth for 2 decades. No behavioral adjustment touches this problem, because there is nothing behavioral left to adjust. The financial advice ecosystem almost entirely addresses problem 1, and then it hands that advice to people living problem 2. And then, here's the part I used to believe before I actually looked at the data, it calls them undisciplined when it doesn't work. Wait, here's why that matters in a way nobody says out loud. When you give problem 1 advice to a problem 2 person, you don't help them. You give them a framework that will fail. And when a framework fails, the person doesn't conclude the framework was wrong. They conclude they are wrong. They internalize it as personal failure. And they carry that shame into every subsequent financial decision, which makes those decisions worse. This is not an accident, but it is fixable. And fixing it starts with knowing which problem you actually have. In the next 2 minutes, I'm going to show you the government data that separates these 2 problems permanently, and the number inside that data that will completely change how you think about every piece of financial advice you've ever received. Here's the twist. And this is where Maya's story gets specific. Researchers at Harvard, using US Census Bureau data, calculated something called residual income. Not income, not rent burden percentage. Residual income, the money left after housing costs for everything else a human being needs to live. For renters earning under $30,000 a year, that number in 2023 was $250 a month. This is where it gets uncomfortable. $250 a month. For food, for your car, for your kids' school supplies, for the copay when you're sick. For anything unexpected. For savings. Maya is not in that bracket. She earns $41,500, but she's close enough that the math rhymes. Her $115 remaining after structural costs isn't a budgeting failure. It is the output of a system that has not adjusted for the income level she's actually at. And here's the plot twist that changes everything. The most common advice for someone in Maya's situation: just budget better, track every dollar, skip the coffee, assumes there is money in the behavioral column to move. But when structural costs already consume 96% of take-home pay, the behavioral column is empty. There is nothing to track. The problem isn't spending behavior. The problem is that the costs that cannot be adjusted have already claimed almost all of the income. You cannot save your way out of a structural problem, not because you lack discipline, because the arithmetic doesn't allow it. Section 2. The mechanism. Let me show you exactly how the 3 structural costs work, because this is where every other video stops short. Most videos will tell you housing is expensive. True. End of discussion. They move on to budgeting tips. I want to show you the actual federal data on all 3 structural costs simultaneously, because the combination is what makes this bracket so specifically trapped. Structural cost 1. Housing. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition publishes a number every year called the housing wage. It's simple. How much do you need to earn per hour to rent a modest 1-bedroom apartment without spending more than 30% of your income? In 2025, that number is $28.17 an hour for a 1-bedroom. Modest, not luxury, just a 1-bedroom that meets HUD's fair market rent standard. A $40,000 salary is $19.23 an hour. That's a $9 gap per hour, every hour you work. And to be clear, this is the standard that financial advisors consider affordable. Below that line is what the government calls cost-burdened. Above it is where the 50-30-20 rule starts to function. You're $9 an hour below the floor of the advice. Structural cost 2, transportation. This is the one almost nobody mentions, because it doesn't feel as obvious as rent. The U.S. Bureau of Transportation Statistics, a federal agency, not a think tank, found that households in the lowest income tier spend 32% of their pre-tax income on transportation. Not just a car payment, the whole system: payment, insurance, gas, maintenance. Here's the thing I genuinely didn't expect when I went through this data. Low-income households who own a car spend 38% of their after-tax income on transportation. That's a bigger slice than their rent in some cases, and nearly 45% of Americans have zero access to public transit that could replace it. So the car isn't optional, it's literally how they get to the job. But it's consuming nearly 40 cents of every dollar they earn. If you're still watching, you're starting to see what I'm building toward. This isn't a problem you can frugality hack, it's a structure, and the structure has 3 walls. Structural cost. 3. Childcare. If you have kids, this is the one that hits the hardest: childcare. Aware of America, they publish annual price data by state, found that the national average cost of childcare in 2024 was $13,128 a year for one child. For a single parent earning $40,000, that's 35% of gross income, before a single dollar of rent, before a car payment, before utilities. For Maya specifically, $975 a month in childcare. That's not a choice. That's the cost of being able to go to work. So add it up. Housing absorbing 36% of take-home, childcare at 34%, transportation at 20%. That's 90% of take-home pay in 3 line items. All of them mandatory, all of them structural. None of them cuttable by drinking black coffee. The advice that says live below your means was written assuming your means have room beneath them. If you've ever had your car break down, transmission, brakes, it doesn't matter, and you didn't have the money to fix it, so you put it on a credit card at 24% and then spent the next 4 months paying off a repair while interest accumulated in the background, slowly erasing any margin you might have had. You already know exactly what I'm talking about. That feeling, that specific combination of I did everything right and it still happened, isn't random. It isn't bad luck or poor planning. It's what happens when there is no savings buffer, because there was no margin to build one, because structural costs consumed it before it could accumulate. And the repair wasn't discretionary. The car wasn't discretionary. And the credit card, with its 25% APR, was the only tool available because no margin means no emergency fund. 37% of American adults cannot cover a $400 emergency expense using only savings. according to the Federal Reserve. Not a survey from a finance blog, the Federal Reserve. And that number has been essentially unchanged for 3 years running, meaning this is a stable condition, not a temporary inflation effect. That's roughly 90 million adults. 90 million people who are one car repair, one missed shift, one medical copay away from a debt cycle. And they have been told, by people with much larger financial margins, that the solution is a better budget. Most people who Google, "Why can't I save money?" at 11 p.m., at night close the tab feeling worse than when they opened it. They get advice that assumes the problem is behavioral. They try the advice, it doesn't work, and they take that as confirmation that the problem is them. The fact that you're still in this video, actually sitting with the data instead of the dopamine hit of a 10 tips list, means you're already approaching this differently than most people around you. That's not a compliment, that's an observation. And it matters because the people who actually change their financial trajectory aren't the ones who find the best shortcut. They're the ones who understand the actual problem first. Here's the layer nobody else covers. This is why I think people subscribe. Maya got offered a raise, $47,000 a year, up from $41,500, an extra $5,500 before taxes, which after federal and state tax would land roughly $350 more per month in her account. She almost took it. Then she did one calculation she had never thought to do. Her childcare costs $975 a month, but she only pays $575 of that, because Indiana's childcare assistance program subsidizes $400 of it, based on her current income. At $47,000 a year, she would no longer qualify for that subsidy. So the math, plus $350 a month from the raise, minus $400 a month in lost subsidy. Net result of accepting a raise, negative $50 a month. Here's something that breaks the usual financial logic, and I want to resolve it in the next 60 seconds. This is called the benefits cliff, and it is not a hypothetical. It affects hundreds of thousands of working Americans in exactly this income bracket. The people earning just enough to be ineligible for assistance, but not enough to replace what that assistance was worth. And here's the resolution. The benefits cliff is a system problem that individual budgeting cannot fix. But there are navigations. Maya's actual solution was to negotiate the extra $5,500 not as salary, which is taxable and affects subsidy eligibility, but as a childcare flexible spending account and additional 401k contributions. Pre-tax benefits, invisible to the eligibility calculation, same value to her employer, completely different outcome for Maya. Net effect, roughly $300 more per month without triggering the cliff. But here's what I think about this. She would never have known to ask for that without understanding the structural mechanics first. If she had just taken the raise as offered, which is what every instinct and every standard financial tip would tell her to do, she would have been worse off. That is the second layer. Not just that the costs are structural, but that the interventions available to you are also structural and invisible unless someone shows you the architecture. Here's what I think nobody's saying about this, and I want to be clear, this is my read, not the data's conclusion. When you look at the three datasets simultaneously, the JCHS residual income collapse, the BTS transportation burden at 32%, and the NLIHC housing wage gap of $9 per hour, what you actually see is not three separate problems. You see one problem expressed in three dimensions. The $40,000 earner has been bidded out of the housing market. That forces longer commutes to cheaper areas. Longer commutes require more car dependency. More car dependency adds a second structural cost. If they have children, childcare is a third. And these three costs compound each other in a way that makes each individual intervention, find cheaper rent, get a cheaper car, reduce childcare hours, partially effective at best, because adjusting one column shifts the weight to another. My read, within 3 to 5 years, the cost burden crisis will visibly migrate further up the income scale. We're already seeing it. Harvard's most recent data shows 43.5 million households cost-burdened in 2024, with the fastest growth happening in the $45,000 to $75,000 range. When $60,000 earners start living this problem, the political and media conversation will change. But the people in the $40,000 bracket will have been living it for a decade by then, largely invisible to that conversation. One implication that goes beyond this video If structural cost burdens are what's preventing retirement savings, and the Federal Reserve says only 35% of non-retirees think they're on track, down from 40% just 4 years ago, then the retirement crisis we keep predicting is not primarily a behavioral problem either. It's a housing crisis with a 30-year lag. I want to say something that I think will land differently depending on where you sit. Just move somewhere cheaper is not financial advice. It is a privilege disguised as a solution. And I want to be precise about why, because I'm not interested in a take. I'm interested in the math. Moving requires money. First and last month's rent, security deposit, a moving truck, lost wages during transition. People without savings margins, which, per the Federal Reserve, is most of the bracket we're discussing, do not have a liquid move fund sitting around. Moving away from family removes the informal childcare networks that lower the sticker price. And the NLIHC data explicitly shows that cheaper cities have lower wages. The rent is lower, but so is the pay. And the gap between them doesn't reliably shrink. For some people, moving worked. I believe them. But making a policy for a demographic based on the experience of the people who successfully made the move is selecting for survivorship. The people it didn't work for didn't make a video about it. I'll let the comments fight about this. They always do. Remember Maya, that kitchen table, that $115? She made 3 moves, none of them were budget better. First, she went to a state childcare navigator, a free service most people in this bracket don't know exists, and learned about the benefits cliff before it ambushed her. She structured the raise correctly. Second, she refinanced her car loan through a credit union. Her credit score had crept up, not through any grand strategy, just through the slow accumulation of on-time payments she'd been making under duress. The rate dropped from 11.9% to 6.9%, $38 a month back. Every month, for the remaining 4 years of the loan. Third, she went on the waitlist for a housing voucher program. Not the end of a problem, the start of a process that takes years, but you cannot get to the front of a list you never joined. None of those are a budget category. None of them required her to stop buying coffee. All of them required knowing that structural problems need structural interventions. Her net financial improvement from 3 structural moves, approximately $338 a month, without changing a single behavioral habit. Wait, here's why that matters in a way nobody says out loud. $338 a month, redirected to a retirement account with a 4% employer match, compounded over 30 years at historical stock market averages. Roughly $500,000 in lifetime retirement wealth. From 3 administrative decisions she was never told were available to her. Maya's specific outcome? Within 18 months of making those 3 moves, she had her first emergency fund. Not 3 months of expenses. Not even 1 month. $800. Sitting in a savings account untouched. The first time her car needed brakes, $620, she paid cash, and felt something she hadn't felt about money in years. Not rich, not fixed, but not one car repair away from a debt spiral. For the first time. Structural versus behavioral isn't just a financial framework, it is a filter for how you think about every piece of advice anyone gives you about money, now, and for the rest of your life. When someone tells you to spend less, the question you will now ask automatically is, which category of cost are they talking about? Because if the answer is structural, the advice is wrong, and you will know that. And you won't internalize the failure when the advice doesn't work. That's not a small thing. That is a completely different relationship with your own financial story. You're one of those people now. If you are a renter in the $30,000 to $70,000 range, and especially if you have children or a car-dependent commute, this changes what the next 10 years of your financial life looks like. Not because I showed you something inspiring, because I showed you the actual architecture. The 50-30-20 rule was not built for you. The just budget better advice was not built for you. And the fact that it hasn't worked is not evidence that you are bad with money. It is evidence that you were given the wrong tool. Here's what I want you to actually do tonight. One thing, not a list. Pull up your last 3 months of bank statements and separate every expense into 2 columns. Structural costs, rent, transportation, childcare, utilities, and behavioral costs, everything else. Don't judge either column. Just separate them. Then look at the structural column and ask, what percentage of my take-home pay lives here? If it's above 75%, you have a structural problem. No behavioral adjustment will solve it. The question shifts from how do I spend less to what structural interventions exist for my income bracket, my geography, and my household type. That question has different answers. Harder to find, more powerful when found. Start there tonight. The next thing to understand, and this is the move that actually changes the trajectory for people in this bracket, is what happens inside your employer's benefits package that most people in this income range are leaving on the table every single year. Not investing. Leaving on the table. The math on that one is brutal. I'll have it for you next.